Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking at the Jamaican Maroons. Now, if you're maybe just getting into this period of history, you might think of the Maroons as, simply runaway slaves from Africa, finding freedom in the mountains.
Right. And look, that's certainly a huge part of their story. Absolutely.
But today we're going to explore something else, a really fascinating idea, actually, that their origins might be, well, older and maybe involve a more complex mix of people and events than is often discussed.
Exactly. We're digging into some interesting material here, specifically Dr. Dennis V. Burke's From Moors to Maroons in Jamaica.
Okay.
And it offers a perspective you don't always hear, suggesting that some of the earliest Maroons, well, they might have connections to expelled populations, people with a Moorish background, who kind of got caught up in the whole transatlantic slave trade system.
Right. So the goal for you listening is really to get beyond that maybe simpler narrative.
Yeah.
And understand the potentially much deeper, more nuanced roots of these communities.
That's the plan.
Okay, so let's start with this term, Moorish background. The source explains that Moors, it wasn't like one specific ethnic group, right?
No, not at all. It was more a European term used back in the Middle Ages for various peoples, mainly Muslims living in North Africa, the Maghreb, but also the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, even Sicily and Malta.
And their history in Spain is, well, it's incredibly significant.
Oh, absolutely central to this. I mean, you have to remember, starting way back in 711 AD, they conquered and ruled Spain for almost 800 years.
800 years.
Yeah, it's staggering. And this wasn't just, holding territory. They built this incredibly sophisticated civilization, especially down in southern Spain. Huge contributions to European culture, science, agriculture.
The source has this really vivid description of their arrival.
It does, yeah. It says something like, their horses were swift as leopards and the riders fiercer than a wolf in a sheepfold at night.
Wow.
And the impact. It mentions the noble Goths were broken in an hour. It just gives you a sense of that shift in power.
Really paints a picture. And like you said, it wasn't just military might. They actually changed the landscape, didn't they? Brought in new things.
Definitely. They introduced crops that are, fundamental to Spain even today. Things like sugarcane, ginger, cotton, rice. So you have this long period of cultural and agricultural fusion.
But that era came to an end. The Moors were eventually pushed out of Spain. Tell us about that.
Right. So that's the Reconquista, a really long campaign, centuries basically. But the final push was led by Ferdinand II and Isabella I.
The famous ones.
The very same. From about 1481 to 1492, culminating in the fall of Granada, their last stronghold.
And what happened then? Was it just leave?
Well, initially there was pressure, intense pressure, for non-Christians to convert. Forced conversions were common, but even for those who converted or their descendants, suspicion remained. And then ultimately, in 1609, there was a final major expulsion of those of Moorish descent, the Moriscos, who hadn't fully assimilated or were suspected of not being true converts.
So a whole population basically uprooted and displaced.
A significant population, yes.
And it's these same monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, who famously funded Christopher Columbus.
Exactly.
And the book points out, Columbus lands in Jamaica in 1494. Just 2 years after Granada fell.
It's a crucial connection, even if indirect. It sets the timeline. Columbus's arrival brings the Spanish, and they begin colonizing Jamaica around 1509.
Okay, so Spain controls Jamaica for, what, about a century and a half?
Roughly, yeah, until 1655. Their main settlement was Villa de la Vega, which later became Spanish Town. And importantly, during this time, the transatlantic slave trade is already underway, involving Spain and Portugal initially.
Gotcha. So fast forward to 1655. The English arrive. They capture Jamaica from the Spanish. What happens to the Spanish settlers and, crucially, the people they had enslaved there?
Well, the English expelled the Spanish colonists and the enslaved people. The source estimates there were around 400 under Spanish rule, maybe as late as 1662. They were essentially left behind, abandoned by the departing Spanish.
They were marooned.
Literally, yes. And that's where the term maroon really takes root in this context. Yeah. The book gives the original definition, which is pretty harsh.
Yeah, what was it?
Put ashore on a desert island or coast and intentionally abandoned, with little hope of rescue or escape. Originally, it was a form of punishment.
A brutal punishment.
Definitely. But the Spanish also apparently used a similar term, maybe cimarron, more broadly, for anything wild or untamed, like the beast who cannot be tamed, or even someone living on the mountaintop away from control.
Okay, so these abandoned, formerly Spanish-held enslaved people, they flee into the mountains. the difficult terrain of Jamaica's interior.
Precisely. They used the landscape to their advantage.
And this is where the author, Dr. Burke, makes that really provocative connection we mentioned earlier.
Yes, this is the core of his argument, or at least his exploration. The book states pretty directly, there are indications that the Negroes taken to the West Indies, including Jamaica, were from Spain and of Moorish background.
Okay, let's unpack that a little. Does this mean they were, like, recent arrivals from North Africa via Spain? Or something else?
It's suggesting a potential link to those populations of African descent who had lived in Spain, possibly for generations, under Moorish rule or afterwards, who absorbed aspects of that culture, spoke Spanish or Arabic, and were then caught up in the expulsions or the general upheaval.
So not necessarily direct from Africa to Jamaica in this specific early group, but perhaps from Africa to Spain, lived there, then forcibly moved to Jamaica via the slave trade.
That seems to be the implication explored in the source, that after the expulsions from Spain, many people of Moorish or mixed descent faced really difficult circumstances, displacement, making them vulnerable to being swept into the expanding slave trade, either directly from Iberia or perhaps through other points in the developing colonial network. It adds a layer before the large-scale British sugar plantations really took off.
Right, and this group, these early Maroons, they weren't easily defeated by the English, were they?
Not at all. The British, despite having a powerful military, really struggled to subdue them in those rugged, hilly interior regions. These Maroons clearly knew the land and were very effective fighters and organizers.
Which led to something quite extraordinary.
Absolutely remarkable, really. The British, the colonial power, were eventually forced to negotiate. They signed a formal peace treaty with the Maroons in 1739.
A treaty. That's huge, isn't it? It implies recognition.
It's massive. You don't sign a treaty with a disorganized band of fugitives. You sign it with a group you recognize as having some form of political organization, sovereignty, and the power to uphold their end of the bargain. It acknowledges them as a distinct entity.
So this treaty essentially grants them political autonomy within the island.
Yes, a degree of autonomy. It recognized their freedom and the right to exist as a separate community. Now, it's important to remember later on, especially as the British sugar economy boomed, many more enslaved Africans escaped the brutal plantations and joined these existing Maroon communities, swelling their numbers and adding to their cultural mix.
Sure, that makes sense. But this initial core group, the ones who perhaps had these Spanish and maybe Moorish connections, they had already established this powerful tradition of resistance and self-governance.
Exactly. That foundation was already there. The source mentions there were actually two major Maroon wars before this 1739 treaty. It wasn't an easy path. And the Maroons themselves weren't monolithic. They were often divided into different groups, like the Leeward Maroons in the west and the Windward Maroons in the east.
And the treaty itself, the one from 1738 won to 739, specifically with Captain Cudjoe and the Trelawney Town Maroons.
Right.
The details are fascinating.
They really are. They spell out the terms very clearly. First, an end to the hostilities, obviously.
Right, Keith.
Then, formal recognition of their freedom and liberty. Crucially, land ownership, they were granted about 1,500 acres between Trelawney Town and the Cockpit Country.
Their own territory.
Their own territory. They had the right to cultivate it, sell their goods at market, though they needed a license for that. They could hunt, but with some restrictions near towns or plantations.
Okay, so rights and freedoms, but also obligations.
Yes, definitely. Big obligations. They were required to help the British suppress any other rebellions on the island and to assist in defending Jamaica against foreign invaders like the French or Spanish.
That's complex. They had to help police other enslaved people.
It's one of the most debated aspects of the treaty, absolutely. They were also obliged to return any new runaway slaves who tried to join them, and they'd get a reward for it, 30 shillings plus costs, according to the text.
Wow. Okay. What else?
There were rules for handling disputes between Maroons and settlers. Provisions for Cudjoe, their leader, to inflict punishments on his own people for breaking laws except the death penalty. They even had to help maintain roads near their territory.
It really sounds like a state within a state agreement.
In many ways, yes. It also stipulated that 2 white men, appointed by the governor, would live with them, ostensibly to maintain friendly correspondence. And it laid out the line of succession for leadership after Cudjoe.
So putting it all together, to the story we started with, Maroons as simply runaway African slaves, it's incomplete.
It seems potentially much richer, much more layered. This idea, drawn from Dr. Burke's work, suggests an earlier stratum, possibly involving people of African descent with deep historical roots in Spain, perhaps tied to Moorish history, who were present in Jamaica before the big English plantations. They formed an initial, powerful core of resistance.
And the 1739 treaty is the undeniable proof of how organized and formidable they were, regardless of the exact mix of their origins by that point.
Precisely. It acknowledges their established power and political significance on the island. That early history, whatever its precise components, clearly forged an incredibly resilient and successful community.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? How might those potentially diverse origins, that mix of experiences from Africa, maybe Spain, maybe Moorish culture, combined with the harsh realities of the Caribbean, how did all that shape their unique culture, their tactics, their sheer determination to remain free?
It adds so many dimensions.
And it prompts a bigger question, too. What other hidden histories, what other complex origins might be lurking beneath the surface of movements like this? How might rediscovering those reshape how we understand resistance, culture, and identity across the board?
It's definitely an encouragement to dig deeper, isn't it? To look for those connections between, say, events in medieval Europe and the formation of communities in the Americas centuries later. The past is rarely simple.
Absolutely. A lot to think about there.